Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest stories. It had been over 10 years since Lewis stepped foot into the attic, a dusty, time-worn sanctuary sealed shut by grief. After Edward's death, the space became a tomb of memories, its silence too loud to face. But on this quiet afternoon, with the sunlight slanting through the cracked attic window, something shifted in him. Perhaps it was age. Or perhaps the question that had begun to whisper in his mind every night before sleep: what have I denied myself? The attic creaked under his cautious steps, each box he passed a ghost from another life. His fingers hesitated over a tattered label, Summer '86, before lifting the lid. Inside, a forgotten photo album waited. The first image struck him like a bolt: himself, decades younger, on a beach, laughing, radiant, unapologetically alive. The man in the photo was bold, sun-kissed, full of joy and rebellion. Lewis's throat tightened. Where had that version of him gone? The answer, unspoken but clear, lay in the attic's heavy air. He had buried that self with Edward, locked it away with fear, age, and silence. And yet here he was again, standing before it, not as a mourner, but as a man daring finally to remember. Just as Lewis was about to close the album, the floorboards behind him creaked, a sound so unexpected it made his heart skip. He turned quickly, startled, and there in the doorway stood Nathan. He hadn't seen his late husband's grandson in years, not since Nathan left for university on the West Coast. But the young man who now stood there was no longer the lanky boy Lewis remembered. At 29, Nathan had grown into someone striking, tall, composed, and with Edward's same curious, observing eyes. "Lewis," he said, lifting a paper bag and a takeaway coffee, "thought I'd surprise you." Lewis blinked, stunned by the sudden convergence of past and present. Nathan stepped further into the attic, his gaze drifting toward the album in Lewis's hands. "That you?" he asked, peering at the picture of young, beach-wild Lewis. "Yes," Lewis replied, almost shyly. Nathan studied it longer than expected. "You look incredible. Carefree. It's hard to imagine you like that." There was no malice in his voice, just wonder. Lewis flushed, a strange warmth unfurling in his chest. They sat together, flipping through the album. Their laughter came easy, unexpected, like a forgotten melody. And slowly, something shifted in the space between them. As Nathan listened, asked questions, and looked at Lewis, not through him but at him, something old stirred to life, the need to be seen, remembered, desired. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something far more dangerous than nostalgia. It was curiosity, reckless, exhilarating, and deeply human. The days that followed Nathan's visit took on a rhythm that Lewis hadn't felt in years. Nathan didn't just drop in for a quick hello, he stayed. "I've got some time off," he explained one morning, pouring 2 cups of coffee in Lewis's outdated but beloved kitchen. "Thought I'd spend it somewhere that feels like home." Lewis tried to mask how much those words affected him. Home. It had been a long time since anyone had referred to this quiet, creaking house as that. Their days were filled with rediscovery, of old records, worn novels, and dusty knickknacks that had once lined Edward's study. Nathan found joy in each forgotten item, but more than that, he seemed genuinely interested in Lewis himself. One afternoon, Nathan held up a photograph of Edward in his youth, posing with Lewis on a boat in Greece. "You looked so happy," he said, eyes locked on Lewis. "Were you?" Lewis's smile faltered. "We were. Once." The conversation that followed unraveled a thread of truth Lewis hadn't shared with anyone since Edward's death: the loneliness, the way grief became routine, the quiet fading of who he used to be. Nathan listened, not out of obligation, but with that same intense, undistracted focus that made Lewis's breath catch. It was the first time in years Lewis felt seen not as a man defined by age, loss, or past titles, but as someone with chapters still unwritten. That night, Lewis found himself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his shirt collar, wondering if he still remembered how to be desired. It was an early autumn morning when Lewis unearthed the box of clothes he hadn't touched since Edward's passing, a weathered collection of vintage suits, scarves, and tucked-away pieces from a life he'd shelved long ago. Nathan had insisted on helping with the attic cleanup, his curiosity bubbling like a kid in a candy store. "What is this?" he asked, holding up a teal blazer with satin lapels. That, Lewis chuckled, was the star of a New Year's party in 1984. Nathan laughed, wide-eyed. "You've got to try it on." At first, Lewis waved the idea off with an embarrassed smile. But Nathan's infectious grin chipped away at his hesitation. Minutes later, Lewis stepped out of the bedroom wearing the blazer, half expecting it to look ridiculous. But Nathan's reaction froze him. His gaze softened, lips parting just slightly. "You look incredible." Lewis hadn't heard those words, not sincerely, in decades. There was a different kind of silence between them now. It wasn't awkward or uncertain. It was charged, tense, intimate. They spent the rest of the day reminiscing, but Lewis couldn't ignore the heat that had bloomed between them. Every brush of Nathan's hand, every glance held just a second too long, Lewis felt like the version of himself he thought had disappeared with Edward. That night, he stood in the mirror again, the blazer draped over the back of his chair. Something had shifted. Not just in the air, but within him. For the first time in years, Lewis felt not just seen, but wanted. And that terrified him. As the days stretched into weeks, Nathan's visits became more frequent, under the guise of attic organization, afternoon coffees, or simply checking in. But Lewis knew. He could feel it in the way Nathan lingered in doorways, in the soft laughs that stretched a little too long, in the shared silences that hummed with something unspoken. One evening, while sorting through old jazz records, their fingers brushed over the sleeve of a Miles Davis album. The touch was fleeting, but the electricity it left in its wake stayed with Lewis long after Nathan had gone. That night, Lewis found himself staring at the ceiling, haunted by a question he didn't dare voice. What if? He had loved Edward deeply, wholly. But Edward was gone. And the ache that Nathan stirred in him wasn't a betrayal, it was a reawakening. Still, there was guilt, gnawing and persistent. Guilt for feeling this way about someone so much younger. Guilt for the rush of adrenaline every time he heard Nathan's car pull into the drive. Guilt for noticing the way Nathan's voice dipped when they were alone, the way his eyes held Lewis's just a bit too long. One Sunday, as golden light poured through the kitchen window, Nathan stayed for tea. They talked about everything: music, politics, dreams, regrets. Then, with a boldness that startled them both, Nathan said, "I think you're afraid to let yourself be happy again." Lewis looked away, heart hammering. Maybe I am. Because letting happiness in now meant tearing open wounds he'd spent years trying to forget. And yet, something inside him whispered, maybe it's time. The warmth between them, once subtle and carefully unacknowledged, began to ripple with a quiet intensity that Lewis could no longer pretend to ignore. One afternoon, while organizing a box of Edward's old keepsakes, Nathan pulled out a faded photo of Lewis in his 20s, laughing carefree, hair whipping in the wind on a coastal cliff. "You look wild here," Nathan said, his voice softer than usual. "Free." Lewis took the photo, stared at the young man he barely recognized. "I was," he murmured, more to himself than to Nathan. "A long time ago." Nathan didn't speak, but his gaze lingered, on Lewis, not the photo, and in it was something achingly sincere, something that made Lewis's skin flush and his breath catch. That night, Lewis couldn't sleep. He wandered the house like a ghost, ending up in the kitchen with a whiskey in hand and memories crashing around him like waves. When he finally dared look in the mirror, he didn't see an old man. He saw someone still capable of feeling, of yearning. The next morning, as he sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, Nathan arrived early, holding 2 cups of coffee. Without a word, he sat beside Lewis, close enough for their knees to touch. "You don't scare me, you know," Nathan said, after a long silence. Lewis turned, startled. "Why would I?" "Because you're real," Nathan replied, his voice shaking a little. "And I haven't let myself want something real in a long time." Lewis's heart stuttered. And then it started to race. The confession arrived in the quietest of moments, unexpected, unguarded, and irreversible. It was a rainy evening, the kind that pulled the world into a hush, where time seemed to slow and emotions had no place to hide. Lewis and Nathan sat in the living room, sipping tea, listening to the patter of rain against the windows. The photo album they had been flipping through now lay closed on the coffee table, a bridge between 2 generations and something else, something neither of them had yet dared to name. Nathan leaned back, eyes searching Lewis's face with a vulnerability that made the older man's breath catch. "I think I'm falling in love with you," Nathan said, so softly it felt more like a thought spoken aloud than a declaration. Lewis stared, stunned. His first instinct was denial, because of the age gap, because of Edward, because of Rachel, but instead of recoiling, he felt warmth bloom in his chest. No one had spoken to him like that in years. It wasn't just the words. It was the truth behind them, the raw, unfiltered honesty. "I don't know what to say," Lewis whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Nathan replied. "I just needed you to know. Because I can't keep pretending like it's not happening." Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with meaning, with the weight of hearts suddenly exposed. Lewis reached out, his fingers grazing Nathan's. No promises, no decisions, just connection. Fragile. Tentative. Real. And in that fragile moment, a door quietly opened. After that night, everything between Lewis and Nathan felt irrevocably altered. There was no grand declaration, no passionate kiss, no immediate unraveling of what was proper, but there was a shift, unmistakable and persistent. The air between them now crackled with a quiet intensity, each shared glance lingering just a second too long, each touch, passing the sugar, brushing hands at the sink, fraught with unspoken feeling. Lewis found himself waking each morning with a strange flutter in his chest, a nervous anticipation he hadn't felt since his 20s. And yet, the joy of it was shadowed by something heavier, guilt. Guilt for what he was feeling. Guilt for Edward, whose memory still filled every corner of the house. Guilt for Rachel, his daughter, who would never understand. Lewis began avoiding mirrors. In them, he saw not just a man aging alone, but a man on the brink of something both beautiful and terrifying. He caught himself smiling at Nathan's jokes, lingering at the dinner table just to hear the younger man speak, inventing excuses to keep Nathan around longer, another box to unpack, another photo to sort. Nathan, for his part, never pushed. He was patient, respectful, but his eyes, they said everything. They asked questions Lewis wasn't ready to answer. One afternoon, Lewis watched Nathan rake leaves in the yard, the wind tugging at his sleeves, the late sun casting a golden halo around him. The ache in Lewis's chest was no longer just loneliness. It was yearning. Deep, inconvenient, dangerous yearning. And for the first time, Lewis didn't want to run from it. The day Lewis found Edward's final letter, tucked inside a worn envelope marked to Lewis, "When you need it most," the world seemed to pause. He had been dusting the old study, a room he rarely entered since Edward's passing, when the envelope slipped from between the pages of an untouched book of poems. His hands trembled as he opened it, the familiar handwriting instantly triggering a flood of memories. "If you're reading this," Edward had written, "it means I'm no longer with you in body, but I'll always be beside you in spirit. Don't close your heart, Louis. You deserve to live again. To love again." Lewis read the letter once, then twice, then 3 more times as the tears fell freely. Edward's words, gentle, knowing, and heartbreakingly selfless, released something locked tight inside him. The guilt he'd carried, the shame of longing for warmth again, the fear of judgment, it all began to loosen. Edward had always seen him more clearly than anyone, even in death. That letter wasn't just a blessing. It was permission. When Nathan came home later that evening, Lewis was in the kitchen, the letter folded neatly beside a steaming pot of stew. His eyes were red but calm. Nathan asked no questions, just walked over and placed a hand over Lewis's. It was warm, steady. Lewis looked up at him, not with fear, not with confusion, but with something closer to resolve. He didn't know what came next. But for the first time, he believed he was allowed to find out. Word spreads fast in a town like theirs, and Lewis had known the moment would come. The whispers started quietly, like a storm gathering in the distance, furtive glances in the grocery store, awkward pauses in conversation, and polite smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. But it wasn't until the Sunday after church, as Lewis walked past a cluster of longtime neighbors, that the judgment truly landed. "It's just unnatural," one woman hissed to another. "Edward's memory deserves better." The words stung, slicing through Lewis with the precision of a blade. He kept his face neutral, eyes ahead, shoulders straight. But inside, his heart was a churning mess of shame and defiance. At home, he found Nathan pacing the porch. "They're talking, aren't they?" he asked, not needing confirmation. Lewis nodded slowly. Nathan reached for his hand and held it tightly. "We knew this wouldn't be easy," he said quietly. "But I'm not going anywhere." That night, Lewis stood in front of a mirror and looked at himself, really looked. The man staring back was no longer just a grieving widower, no longer just Edward's husband. He was someone reclaiming pieces of himself long buried beneath decades of quiet devotion and quiet denial. It wasn't just about the town's disapproval or the generations between them. It was about choosing to live in the light again, even if it meant enduring the shadows. And when Nathan came up behind him, resting a hand gently on his shoulder, Louis finally whispered, "Let them talk. I'm done hiding." It wasn't just strangers who couldn't accept it. Rachel's reaction nearly shattered Louis. When she showed up unannounced one rainy evening, soaked from the downpour and flushed with fury, he braced himself. "Nathan?" She spat as soon as he opened the door. "Seriously, Dad? He's practically my brother." Her words cut deeper than she knew, more wounding than any whispers from town gossips. "He's not," Louis replied quietly, trying to hold her gaze. "He's never been more than a step-grandson. You know that." But Rachel wasn't ready for calm logic. She paced the living room like a caged storm, hurling accusations, her voice laced with betrayal and disbelief. What would Mom think? What would Edward say? Louis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the drawer in the hallway and pulled out the old letter, the one Edward had written years ago, for when you need it most. He handed it to her, his hand trembling. As she read, her expression slowly shifted. The storm behind her eyes dimmed, confusion battling with understanding. She didn't speak right away. When she finally looked up, her voice was softer, but still uncertain. "I just don't get it, Dad. He's so much younger. What could he possibly see in you?" Louis smiled sadly, his heart aching. "He sees me, Rachel. Not the father, not the widower. Just me." Her silence held the weight of reconciliation not yet offered, but also the beginning of something better. Not approval, perhaps, but maybe, just maybe, acceptance. The weeks that followed Rachel's visit were filled with quiet resilience. Louis and Nathan weathered the storm of whispers and judgment with a calm born not from defiance, but from a deep, steady conviction in what they had found. The town's curiosity eventually waned, and those who mattered most began to understand that what tied them together wasn't scandal, it was something raw and rare. They didn't need public approval, they needed each other. Together, they rediscovered joy in the simple things, cooking meals side by side in the evenings, strolling through the old neighborhood with fingers entwined, planting flowers in the garden Edward once tended. Louis, who had long felt like his best years were behind him, found himself laughing more freely, sleeping more soundly, and speaking without restraint. And Nathan, well, he seemed to bloom under the quiet warmth of Louis's presence, finding in him not just a partner, but a kindred spirit. The age gap no longer felt like a canyon but a bridge, linking two souls who had been missing something until they found it in each other. Louis even started painting again, encouraged by Nathan's unwavering belief in his talent. Their home became a sanctuary, not just from judgment but from the fear of wanting too much, too late. It was, in many ways, a rebirth for both of them. And in those soft twilight moments, wrapped in laughter and music and shared silence, Louis finally understood, love doesn't come on a schedule. It simply arrives, when you're ready to receive it. One golden autumn afternoon, as amber leaves danced across the porch and the scent of cinnamon tea lingered in the air, Louis stood in front of an old mirror tucked into the corner of his study. He hardly recognized the man reflected back, shoulders straighter, eyes clearer, a quiet strength radiating from within. It had been nearly a year since Nathan walked back into his life, and everything had changed. Not just externally, the whispers had faded, the stares had dulled, but inside, where it mattered most. Louis no longer carried the weight of years he thought he'd lost. Instead, he wore them like a badge, each wrinkle a chapter in the story he had finally reclaimed. That evening, as twilight bathed the living room in dusky pink light, Nathan knelt beside the fireplace, fiddling with a stack of old vinyls. "What do you want to hear tonight?" he asked, glancing back with that easy smile that always undid Louis a little. "Surprise me," Louis replied, voice rich with contentment. Music filled the room, crackling softly, and Louis crossed over, pulling Nathan up into a slow dance. They moved together, unhurried, barefoot on creaky wood floors. "Do you regret any of this?" Louis asked, his voice almost a whisper. Nathan pressed his forehead to his and answered without hesitation, "Not for a second." And in that quiet space between a question and an answer, Louis knew this wasn't just a chapter. It was the final act of a life well lived, a love not just found but earned. Lewis's story reminds us that it's never too late to rediscover ourselves or to embrace unexpected love, no matter what society says. In today's world, where we often feel pressured to follow timelines or fit into boxes, his journey teaches us to listen to our hearts, even if that means breaking from convention. Life doesn't end after loss, aging, or hardship. If anything, those moments can be a beginning. So give yourself permission to explore, to connect deeply, and to love boldly. Because the truth is, happiness has no deadline, and the courage to pursue it is always worth it.